Last week, we began this particular sermon, two-part sermon, by noting that many people here in the United States are desperately working to stop the present belligerent conspirators who are bent on destroying this country and hoping that they can somehow bring about the restoration of America. In like manner, we also saw that the elect, those that God has selected and drawn to His Son, the Savior, at this time, are also hoping for the end of the present evil cosmos and the restoration of all things that will occur at the coming of the Messiah, the Son of Righteousness, the one who comes and breaks the day, the new day, the day of glory and the day of the presence of God on earth. We began last time by reviewing that sin was the reason why the world is now in its current dilemma. By choosing to submit to the serpent, rather than obeying God, Adam surrendered the dominion of the earth to Satan, who has used that authority that he was able to usurp to tear down and destroy humanity. We then began examining how the four horsemen of the first four seals in Revelation 6, how they provide the historical background of what the world has now become under Satan's rulership, and show why all of the horrible cataclysmic events described in the remainder of the scroll of Revelation must come upon the earth. There's no other option. It must happen. We concluded last time by discussing the riders of the white as well as the red horses. So today, let's go back to Revelation chapter 6 and down to verse 5, and we'll pick up where we left off with the black horse, the third of the four horsemen. We find here in verse 5 of Revelation 6, when he opened the third seal, I heard the living creature say, "Come and see." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius," or as some translations will bring out, which was a day's pay at that time. So a quart of wheat for a day's pay. Work a whole day just for a quart of wheat. Or 3 quarts of barley for a day's pay. Not worth as much as the wheat, but nonetheless. And do not harm the oil and the wine. The symbolism connected with black is despair. You know, if you attended or watched the movie Les Mis, you'll know that in there they were talking about the colors red and black, and black is the color of despair. Okay, we're all very familiar with that. Black is again about despair, and despair, desperation, and hopelessness are always found in the aftermath of destruction. In fact, the only outcome that can be expected from the actions of the rider of the previous horses, which were deception and division, the only outcome is destruction. You're destroying something. The rider on the black horse is responsible for much more destruction than the devastation caused by famine, which is the sole way that this horseman is usually portrayed. It's only famine. No, it's not only famine. It's about destruction. Now, he does carry here, we find, a pair of scales in order to weigh out things. And the reference to wheat and barley connects the scales to apportioning food. Grains, which are the mainstay of most of the world's population as far as eating. And so it's apportioning food. Now, this definitely indicates that a shortage of food is part of the black horse's duties or responsibilities or what he's doing. But it does not limit the rider of the black horse strictly to destroying crops and creating famines. The fact is, the disruption of food supplies is the most immediate concern in the aftermath of every disaster that brings destruction to man. It's always a concern about food and water, whether it be Whether the disaster is man's own doing, like the war in Ukraine or every other war, that's by man's doing, or whether the disaster is categorized as a natural disaster, as in the case of earthquakes that hit here and there, volcanoes, tsunamis, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, plagues, you name it. There are a lot of other terrible disasters that occur as well. Now, regarding natural disasters, one thing we need to keep in mind and realize is that the devil now controls the dominion of the earth. It was surrendered to him as the serpent in the Garden of Eden. Therefore, Satan can influence the weather, as well as the spread of plagues, and possibly even the geologic underpinnings of the land masses and islands. In fact, Satan's involvement in some of these things, by God's allowance, is found back in the book of Job. In Job chapter 1, let's note this. Job chapter 1. And verse 16. Job 1:16. Now, this, of course, is after God has given Satan the opportunity to go out and to smite things that would affect Job's attitude toward God. And it says, while this is a messenger who was reporting that Job's oxen and donkeys had been stolen, when this messenger was still speaking, another messenger also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven, fell from the sky, and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Now here it talks about the fire of God. This may have been lightning. God allowed Satan to use lightning in order to strike in multiple places and kill all of the flock of sheep as well as those shepherds that were taking care of it. We're not told exactly what the fire of God is here. We have the fire of God, the fire and brimstone that came down and destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Could be something like that. But anyway, God did allow Satan to do this. Satan was the one responsible for taking out Job's family, Job's his flocks, his herds, and so on. In verse 18 of Job 1, while he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And suddenly a great wind came from across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead, all of his children, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And so once again, we find that Satan can manipulate the wind. In addition to outright killing human beings, Satan can also subject man to experiencing bodily suffering. And for that, let's go to chapter 2 and verse 7. Job 2, verse 7. And we read here, so Satan went out from the presence of the Eternal. God told him, you cannot. This is God the Word that was speaking with Satan here. He told him that he could not kill Job. And so that's the bound. You can't kill him. Well, Satan went just about as far as you can go without taking his life. Because it says he struck Job how? With painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. God states, back in the book of Revelation, that his wrath is reserved in the coming trumpet plagues. But until then, until that time of the pouring out, the distribution of his wrath, Satan is ruling this planet within the bounds that God has set for him. And Satan then is responsible for much of the destruction that's portrayed by the rider of the black horse of despair. Now, also back here in Revelation 6, in conjunction with the scales carried by the rider of the black horse, we find God putting restraints on this rider, because it mentions here a quart of wheat. Notice it's specified. 3 quarts of barley specified. Also restraint. Do not harm the oil and the wine. This shows that God will not allow Satan, will not allow the serpent to destroy all food. God allows him to make food scarce, and very expensive in times of destruction, but not totally destroy it. Now, bringing on the disasters that he does, the devil interrupts the growth cycles of crops. He kills much livestock, and he leaves many weakened by malnutrition and some by starvation. This leads directly into the power then of the rider of the fourth horse here in verse 7 of Revelation 6. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. The power was given to them, Death and Hades, over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, with hunger, some translations famine, with death, or some translations disease, pestilence. Basically, the word means events that lead to death. Any event that leads to death. And by the beasts of the earth. Now, the actual color of this horse, according to the Louw-Nida lexicon, Greek and English lexicon, is a pale greenish gray. A pale greenish gray. That color represents the color of a corpse, of a dead person, which is easily related to the rider, because the rider is called Death, and so he appears as death. The rider of this horse spreads untimely or premature death throughout the earth. And Hades, which we know is the grave, follows him by providing a place for the corpses to be left and removed from sight. It's clear that this rider began its gruesome ride very early in the history of humanity. It wasn't many years after Adam was expelled from the Garden of Eden that the first untimely, the first premature death occurred on earth. And it's recorded here in Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. And in verse 8. Genesis 4:8. Now Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose against Abel his brother and killed him. Notice, the first human being born by natural means killed the second human being that was born. This is the way humanity started out. Cain refused to resist the power that Satan used to inflame his anger. He refused. He was warned. God warned him. Sin is crouching at the door, but he didn't do it. And it led him to surrender to his anger. And as a result, he cut short the life of his brother Abel. Just as God placed restraints on the rider of the third horse, so he does with the rider of the fourth horse. God has set bounds on Satan to prevent him from destroying all life. Because this is what Satan would love to do, is to exterminate everybody. But no, God won't allow that. God will allow the devil to prematurely kill no more than 1/4 of the human population. He specifies that, again, back in verse 8 of Revelation 6. Power was given to him over a fourth. Only a fourth. And so, again, God stipulates, he puts restraints. All of the listed methods of being killed refer, here in Revelation 6, refer to ways of dying prematurely. Ways to die prematurely. Sword, hunger, death, all events that lead to death, like earthquakes again, floods, windstorms, diseases. Now we know bioweapons. We have experienced that now. All of these ways are connected to what Satan does, as well as the beasts of the earth. Now, of course, beasts of the earth, we think of poisonous animals. Snakes, and especially in Central and South America, lots of poisonous frogs. You don't want to touch them. We have the little box jellyfish down off Australia, and those things will kill you in a couple of minutes, I think. The poison is so great. So we have all of those poisonous animals. We have carnivores that are looking for other flesh to eat. We have microscopic animals that bring about things like cholera and malaria, typhoid, all kinds of things that take place. Now we have nanotechnology, and so we have these things that man injects into other men in order to make profit, make money for themselves, greed. And it doesn't matter what happens to those who fall into their reasoning. When assessing the causes of death from around the world at any given time in the history of mankind, no more than 75%, 3 out of 4 human beings, actually dies from old age. That is, they live out the normal lifespan. The rest, the other 25%, are prematurely dead, die premature deaths. It becomes evident that the 4 horsemen, deception, division, destruction, and death, represent the weapons that Satan, the devil, is using against mankind to keep humanity under, as we saw last time, very stressful, burdensome circumstances. Not a time of great joy, that we have experienced, that man has experienced through 6,000 years. The message of the 4 horsemen is that man, on his own, is doomed to be deceived and divided. He's doomed to that because of the rider of the first and the second horses, which again result in destruction and death. In fact, without the restraints that God has placed on Satan, man and all life on earth would have already been destroyed. That's the simple fact. The only way the devil's hold can be broken and the activities of the 4 horsemen that we read about in Revelation 6 terminated, how they're terminated, is by the intervention of the promised Messiah, the Son of Righteousness. Mr. Henry's covered very thoroughly righteousness and the need that we have of being connected to the Son of Righteousness. And it's with his coming that the darkness that's over the earth now will finally be removed. The opening of the 7th seal, back in Revelation, reveals the steps that God will take to rid the world of the effects of the activities of the 4 horsemen. With the removal of Satan after Christ's return, all of the negative conditions that the devil has been responsible for bringing on the world during this first 6,000 years, this rulership that he usurped from Adam, that dominion he has now is going to be removed. Deception, division, destruction, and death. It's going to come to an end. This removal will usher in a time of relief. The time of relief that the Apostle Peter spoke of, we saw last time in Acts chapter 2, which will quickly be followed by the times of the restoration of all things. The time of restoration will bring a restoring to this earth of the utopian condition pictured in the Garden of Eden before man surrendered his dominion to the serpent. There are 5, there are some more, but there are 5 major, easily identifiable restorations that must be carried out in order to restore the utopian paradise that we find back at the beginning of the Bible in the Garden of Eden. So we're going to cover 5 things, 5 major things that will be a part of the restoration of all things. The first is that humanity will again have access to the tree of life. Humanity will again have access to the tree of life. Back in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 22, we find here that due to Adam's choice to become the slave of the serpent, and he made that choice by not doing and obeying what God told him to do, he became the slave of the serpent. God took away the privilege from Adam, Eve, and all their descendants, took away the privilege of access to the tree of life. Now, it was given to him. All the trees in the garden, freely eat. Tree of life, all of them except the one, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, representing, as Mr. Flatt brought out, human reasoning. Got to reason it out. The tree of life represents the Spirit of God. Access to the Spirit of God. It was cut off. Notice here in verse 22, Genesis 3, "Then the eternal God said, Behold, the man has become like one of us." This is the Father, or at that time it was the Most High and the Word discussing this. "To know good and evil. And now, lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." And it requires the Spirit of God to live forever. "Therefore, the eternal God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life." God had to close off access to his Spirit, which before, again, was symbolized by the tree in the middle of the garden that had been available to Adam, Eve, and all of their descendants. He had to cut it off because sin cut them off. Once the times of restoration come and the deception of Satan is removed, humanity will be eager at that time to have access to God and to have access to that Spirit. They'll want the nourishment that only God can provide. Note in Isaiah chapter 2. Isaiah chapter 2. And we'll begin here in verse 2. Isaiah 2, verse 2. "Now, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Eternal's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, above all other nations, and shall be exalted above the hills, the minor nations, the major and the minor nations." That government is going to be over all other governments, and apparently there will be governments allowed in the various nations, but they'll all be subservient to the government over which Jesus Christ reigns. "Shall be exalted, and all nations shall flow to it. Many people shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of the Eternal, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Eternal from Jerusalem." Without Satan's influence, there's going to be a dramatic change in the nature of man. A huge change. Carnality, just, hard-hearted carnality will no longer be the state of the mind of man. Let's note this in Romans chapter 8. Romans chapter 8 and verse 7. The Apostle Paul describes what the condition of the human mind is in this world. He says, Romans 8:7, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, or it's hostile toward God, the New American Standard translates. "For it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be." Or as the New English translation brings out, "For it does not submit," the carnal mind does not submit to the law of God, nor is it able to do so, because it requires the Spirit. It requires God's Spirit to be with and then in order to make it possible to submit. After the coming of the times of restoration, humanity will possess totally different minds than those described by Paul. Now, that does not mean that the mind will no longer be subject to the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of things that we can gather and pull together for ourselves that John mentions. Those things are still there. Those things will still be there. But the abject, "I will not do what you say, God. I will not. I'll choose the day that I want to worship. You can't tell me I've got to do the seventh day? No, I get to choose. You don't tell me." No, that kind of mind is not going to be around. There will be a great desire to know what God has to say. not what one can reason out on his own, attachment to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. After this, or I should say in this yearning that we read about in Isaiah 2, verses 2 and 3, will be the direct result of opening up the way to the tree of life. Ezekiel chapter 36 describes this event. Ezekiel 36 and Ezekiel 36, verse 26. Here, God tells Ezekiel to write and record in Ezekiel. The Son of Man, as he's called here, does a good job of doing so. He says, I will give you a new heart. Notice, a new heart. Now, this is specified about the descendants of Israel, but this certainly extends on to all nations. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will take the heart of stone out of your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes, and you will keep my judgments and do them. Then you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers. You shall be my people, and I will be your God. And so we see that there will be access, once again, to what the tree of life symbolized for all of mankind, because all of Abraham's descendants are involved in this as well, not just his descendant through Jacob, Israel, but all nations, because of Abraham, will have access to the Spirit. All right, the second major item that will be restored is that life will again be filled with peace and joy. Life will again be filled with peace and joy. Once Adam, and back in Genesis 3 again, once Adam surrendered his dominion to the devil, sorrow and pain became the destiny of man. Here in Genesis 3, verse 16, Genesis 3 and verse 16. It says, to the woman, God said, I will greatly multiply your sorrow and your conception. In pain you shall bring forth children. Now, the increase in this pain is due to sorrow with birth. Again, the reason for increase in sorrow with birth is not, I know there are birth pains. In order to get that kid out, there is a certain amount of pain. But this is not all God is talking about. He's talking about there will be an increase in sorrow with birth because all of the descendants of the woman, Eve, all of her descendants, which is, we are those descendants. We all trace ultimately our genealogy back to Adam and Eve. That's where it all started. Noah brought, that his genealogy went back to Adam and Eve, and he brought that through the flood, and now we're all related in some way to Noah. All right? But again, the fact that every one of their descendants the fact that they're cut off from God and under the usurped authority of the devil, this is the reason for the sorrow in childbirth, because of what the sin of disobeying God has led to the fact that all of humanity has had to suffer. Suffer because of being ruled over by a tyrant who hates mankind and would love to wipe them all out. Now, since man was given dominion over all life forms on earth, the serpent also received that authority when man yielded himself to Satan. That same dominion. This is the reason why, as we've seen several times during the feast, the whole creation, it says back in Romans, is in travail today. Satan transformed the serenity of the animal kingdom by altering the nature and the physiology of some of the animal life, transforming some into carnivores, making some of them poisonous, in order to create a survival of the fittest arrangement within the animal kingdom. And that's what we see today. the sorrow and pain now being experienced by man and nature will at last be changed to peace and joy at the times of restoration. Again, in Isaiah chapter 2. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 4. Breaking into verse 4, last part, it says, "They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." We find that the destruction brought on humanity by the serpent will be changed in his absence, in the absence of the serpent, to constructive activities when God's way is restored to the earth. Instead of things being destroyed, they will be constructed. In Isaiah chapter 11, a few pages over, Isaiah 11, verse 6, talks about the change in the animals. Isaiah 11:6, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young ones shall lie down together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox," change in the carnivores here. "The nursing child shall play on the cobra's hole, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the viper's den. No more poisonous snakes. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the eternal as the waters cover the sea." So we find that the carnivores and the poisonous animals will be altered so that no threat of hurt or harm will even come from the animal kingdom, much less from other human beings. The way the animal kingdom operates today is not a reflection of the mind of God. God's mind and design are portrayed in the way the animal kingdom is pictured here in Isaiah 11, verses 6 through 9. That's the way it was originally. Things changed after Satan took over. Now, that brings us to the third major restoration, and that is the family unit. The family unit will be the most important human institution. The family unit. Not some political party that thinks that they have the right to take over family today and destroy family. That is not what will be allowed. The family unit is the focus. The whole reason for this incredible universe that's been created by God, that at least He allows us to see, is for the development of family. He wants to add children to His family. And so the whole plan of God is about family. Not destroying it, but building it and increasing it. That's what it's all about. Due to the division that Satan established throughout his usurped dominion since the Garden of Eden, marriages and families have suffered dramatically throughout the millennium. Unbelievable. Let's go back to Genesis 3 again, verse 16, and pick up the last part of this verse. Genesis 3, latter part of verse 16. I'll read this from the Revised English Bible. God tells Eve, "You will desire your husband, but he will be your master." Not your companion, but your master. God tells us that He created the woman to naturally desire to come under the protection and security of her husband. But God also shows here, by what He says, that husbands would take advantage of that inherent trait and domineer rather than properly love their wives and lead their families. And so Satan has played a very important part in the destruction of family and the destruction of marriage. Since mankind was cut off from the knowledge that would guide them in understanding the differences and the needs of their mates, and at the same time would be under the divisive influence of the prince of the power of the air, the proper relationship that would should exist in marriage would be corrupted, which one major result of that corruption is noted here in Matthew 19 by Jesus. Notice here in Matthew 19 and verse 3. Matthew 19, verse 3. It says, "The Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?' And he answered and said to them, 'Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female?' That's the only way he made them. And said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh.' They come together and they compose one unit. No longer two separate, they're now one. So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, because He's the one that instituted marriage, let not man separate." Don't think that you can take God's position and destroy marriage. You know, God put it together, only God could take it apart. But nope, man says, God puts it together. I can surely take it apart. That's the way it's been. So, they said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" He said to them, "Moses, because of what? The hardness of your hearts, because you're blooming carnal, like Romans 8:7 said. Because of your carnal minds, your hardness of your hearts, because of that, you were permitted to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, the way God wanted it at the start, going back to paradise, the utopian Garden of Eden, how things were there. That's what's going to be restored. From the beginning, it was not so. In the utopia of the Garden of Eden, marriage was for the duration of physical life. That's the way it was. With the allowance of divorce came further dismantling of the family unit. However, this concession that was given to Israel because of their carnal minds will not be allowed in the times of restoration, because as we saw back in Ezekiel 36:26, God will take away the hardness of their hearts. The hard heart, the heart of stone, will be replaced by a heart of flesh. When that time comes, humanity's approach to life will be based on the thinking of converted minds. Not carnal minds, but converted minds. Every husband and every wife will view marriage from the same perspective as God, a lifelong commitment for the building and strengthening of family. In Isaiah chapter 54, Isaiah chapter 54, we're told about conditions after the coming of the Son of Righteousness. Isaiah 54 verse 13, we're told, "All your children shall be taught of the eternal," or by, some translations, by the eternal, "and great shall be the peace of your children." Notice that. Children will have peace. You look around the world today, you don't have thugs, who destroyed a painting over there in London, and glued themselves to the wall, throwing all kinds of tantrums. Those kids are not at peace. I guess these were probably not kids, maybe early 20s or something. I don't know. The picture's hard to tell. They were human beings. That's all I know. Discernment of anything more than that is up to, I guess, the individual. But, look, there's just no peace. Why do we have such an incredible problem with drug addiction in this country? Because people aren't at peace. They're not at peace. It says that your children, great shall be the peace of your children, because Jesus Christ will take a direct role to ensure the success of families. The peace enjoyed by children is made up of the peace of mind that comes from having parents who love each other, who outwardly show love to their children and provide stability for the family. That's what gives them peace. Anything else, they're uncomfortable. There's no security. And it warps their minds. Over in Zechariah chapter 8. Zechariah chapter 8. Verse 3. Zechariah 8, verse 3. Thus says the Eternal, I will return to Zion and dwell in the midst of Jerusalem. Jerusalem shall be called the city of truth, the mountain of the Eternal of hosts, the holy mountain. Thus says the Eternal of hosts, old men and old women shall again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each one with his staff in his hand because of great age. The streets of the city, notice, shall be full of boys and girls playing in its streets. The indication here is that grandparents, great-grandparents, and maybe great-great-grandparents will be available for their grandchildren to come to speak with. And they'll be there, those grandparents and so forth, to teach those grandchildren or great-grandchildren the wisdom of going God's way, because they'll have decades of going and living God's way, and they'll be able to relate that to their descendants, providing the right example of dedication and loyalty to each other as well as to the family unit. Because families are going to stay, in their areas. All the tribes are going to be given. Remember in Ezekiel, they're going to be apportioned, this tribe there and this tribe there. Other nations will be placed in their locations, and that way families stay together. They're not torn apart and scattered all over so that you never see some of your relatives. They're never seen again. Nope, family needs to stay close. All right, the fourth major restoration is that the conditions of the Garden of Eden, the conditions found in the Garden of Eden, soil fertility and abundant water, will be established throughout all the earth. Throughout all the earth. The conditions of the Garden of Eden, soil fertility, abundant water, will be established throughout the earth. In the original utopian arrangement, man had been given a garden where all of his food needs could be met without a lot of physical labor. You didn't have to go out and begin working at 4 o'clock in the morning until the sun went down. That's been the way it has been for the majority of humanity, up until really kind of the modern age. That's the way it was. Still is for many. But all Adam had to do, you go back to that garden, all he had to do was dress it and keep it. Dress it and keep it. In other words, keep the vegetation under control, because they're going to grow like mad. Keep it under control by pruning it, by thinning it. Take care of it. That's all you got to do, and it'll provide all you need. But once he chose to disobey God, back in Genesis 3 again, we find that he lost the paradise. He lost it. Genesis 3, verse 17. Genesis 3:17. I'll read from the New International Translation here. To Adam, he, God, said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil, you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. The curse on the ground was twofold. First, just as Satan allowed man's nature to be altered, and the fact that was done by Satan's influencing his mind, and alter the animal kingdom in several ways, so he seems to have been able to alter the plant kingdom, just like he altered man's thinking, like he altered the the animal kingdom with carnivores and poisonous snakes and whatever, so it seems he was able to alter the plant kingdom. Secondly, that's one reason for the increase, the problems, as we have up here and in the great Northwest. We got all this wretched tumbleweed, not native up here. They brought it from Asia somewhere, and so now we got all this wretched tumbleweed, and we've got, we call it Canadian thistle. I don't have anything against Canadians, but I do have something against what they call Canadian thistle. But it's just wherever you look, and you can't get rid of it, no matter what you try to do. But we have those things, and I think the devil must have played a role in that. It just seems that way. At any rate, because he was cut off from the tree of life, which would have revealed to Adam how to keep the environment unpolluted and productive, man would, to experiment on his own. Tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Human reasoning now. And with the corrupting influence of the devil bombarding his mind, man would then pollute his environment. He would deplete the soil so that all that could grow in the soil would be useless vegetation. Basically, that was it. So between man not having access to the truth, the whole truth, only certain truth that he could learn by experimentation with the way of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that's the reason we're in the condition we are today in this world. However, once the times of restoration of all things arrives, God will provide humanity with a totally renewed environment, where, once again, man will have all of his food needs met with a minimal amount of physical labor. How do we know that? Because of what we read. Isaiah chapter 55. Isaiah 55 and verse 12. Isaiah 55, verse 12. I'll read from the New Living Translation. It says, "You will live in joy and peace." Not pain and sorrow, but you will live in joy and peace. The mountains and hills will burst into song, and the trees of the field will clap their hands. Where once there were thorns, cypress trees will grow. Where nettles grew, myrtles will sprout up. These events will bring great honor to the Eternal's name. They will be an everlasting sign of His power and love. Note that the land isn't groaning in travail when this time comes. These types of trees indicate a sufficient increase in the amount of water. In chapter 43 of Isaiah 43 and verse 18. I'm going to read verse 18 from the Complete Jewish Bible. Isaiah 43:18. "Stop dwelling on past events and brooding over times gone by." Okay, that can be very applicable to us today. Stop dwelling on past events and brooding over times gone by. In other words, don't long for things to be like they were in past years, when things were better for us, at least, comparative to other people in the world. No matter how good those times may have been, the world was still at that time in complete opposition to God, in opposition to God's way and God's desire and God's will. 20 years ago, let's just drop back 20 years ago, 2002, okay? 22 years ago, the average number of abortions, okay, the number of murders by abortion each day performed only in the United States of America, good old USA, was around 2,200. 2,200 abortions a day on average. Since Roe v. Wade, back in 1973, of course it's kind of been overturned now, but from that point in 73 to now, approximately 63 million Murders by abortion have occurred in this country alone. Who knows how many in China? Because they had that one-child policy. Think of how many children were murdered over that time. In addition, you go back 20 years ago, the average number of murders every day in the United States was 44. 44 murders, quite a difference in 2,200. 44 generally adults murdered as compared to these tiny little babies. Then we had reported rapes numbered per day, 260. 260 per day. Reported robberies, 1,150 per day. That's just the ones that were reported. Many more were not reported, just like anything else. These statistics, when you go back and look, and you can look them up. They've got these websites, U.S. whatever, and you can see how many murders, abortions, whatever occurred in this country every year going back for decades and decades. But these statistics do not support the idea sometimes that there were good old days in our past. They were good old days. Not based on God's definition, they weren't. On God's definition, this was rebellion against Him. And maybe those things didn't affect us, but it still affected, the rest of our fellow man. And so, good old days, there haven't been any since the Garden of Eden. So he goes on here in verse 19. Stop dwelling on past events, brooding over times gone by. Behold, God says, I will do a new thing. Now it shall spring forth. Shall you not know it? I will even make a road in the wilderness and rivers, not pools, but rivers in the desert. God states that what He is going to do is new. Since the curse was declared after Adam sinned and surrendered the dominion of the earth to Satan in Eden, the earth has never experienced this miracle that he's talking about here in this passage. This is new. This is new. This is not the way it's been for the last 6,000 years. In Isaiah 41, just back a couple of pages, Isaiah 41, verse 18. God says, I will open rivers in desolate heights and fountains in the midst of the valleys. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and the dry land springs of water. I will plant in the wilderness the cedar and the acacia tree, the myrtle and the oil tree. I will set in the desert the cypress tree and the pine and the box tree together. In chapter 35, there's more. Isaiah is filled with all of the things that God is going to do. Isaiah 35, verse 1, the New Living Translation has, even the wilderness and desert will be glad in those days. The wasteland will rejoice and blossom with spring crocuses. Yes, there will be an abundance of flowers and singing and joy. The deserts will become as green as the mountains of Lebanon, as lovely as Mount Carmel or the plain of Sharon. There the Lord, the Eternal, will display His glory, the splendor of our God. These events mean changes in water availability on a permanent basis. Never again will the land suffer drought. Never again will crops not flourish. Going on down here, latter part of verse 6. It says, springs will gush forth in the wilderness, and streams will water the wasteland. The parched ground will become a pool, and springs of water will satisfy the thirsty land. Marsh grass and reeds and rushes will flourish where desert jackals once lived. So again, he shows us where formerly barren, dry land will have such abundance of water that aquatic plants will become the normal sight around there. In chapter 32 of Isaiah, Isaiah 32, verse 15, until the Spirit is poured out upon us from on high, and the wilderness becomes a fruitful field, and the fruitful field is counted as a forest. So he says here, basically at the time that the Son of Righteousness comes, when the event in Ezekiel 36:26 takes place, land that was useless up till now will become productive land that will produce and will produce even more plentifully. Land that was productive would be even more productive. Isaiah 51. Back in the other direction now. Isaiah 51 verse 3. Isaiah 51, 3. For the Lord, the Eternal, will comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places. He will make her wilderness, how? Like Eden, like the paradise. Going all the way back to where He put man to start with. He will make her wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Eternal. Joy and gladness will be found in it, thanksgiving and the voice of melody. God says He is responsible for the lush vegetation, like it was in the Garden of Eden. All you got to do now is dress it and keep it. He was the one who planted the Garden of Eden. He's the one that's going to do this, to restore it. After all, as we covered on the Feast of Trumpets, there's not going to be anything left. God's going to have to do some major change in what this earth is like. He's going to have to get rid of every polluting thing there is. He's going to have to clean the water. He's going to have to recreate fish and whatever else. And again, Ezekiel tells us about some of those things. Again, this blessing is God's doing of what's coming. Over in Amos chapter 9, we've covered this several times. I want to read a different translation, though. Amos 9, last part of Amos, verse 13. I'll read from the New Living Translation. Here it says, "The time will come, says the Eternal, when the grain and grapes will grow faster than they can be harvested." Now that's productive. Faster than they can be harvested. Then the terraced vineyards on the hills of Israel will drip with sweet wine. This polluted planet will be so perfectly restored by God after Satan is removed and the times of refreshing and restoration have come that the soil's fertility will cause phenomenal crop growth. No one could ever complain about being hungry again. It would be impossible because it's going to be like the garden of God. Now, the fifth major restoration, and that is the righteous will not suffer physical death as we know it today. The righteous will not suffer physical death as we know it today. God originally, let's turn back to Genesis chapter 3 again. God originally indicated to Adam that physical death would come to him only if he disobeyed God. Now, after surrendering to the serpent by disobeying God, God told Adam that his life would end and his physical body would decompose, be gone. Here in chapter 3 of Genesis, verse 19, God tells Adam, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return," because you're going to die. Death rode the fourth horse. Death here is associated with the serpent. Once he is removed and the times of restoration begin, death as we know it today, as we experience it with loved ones and friends and others, will cease. It's going to cease for the vast majority of humanity through the 1,000 years and through the white throne judgment, which again, we're keeping the feast of the 8th day today, reflecting that time, that third day of judgment for salvation. Through that, the same situation, the transformation from flesh to spirit, in the blinking of an eye of the saints who are alive at the return of Christ, is a prelude to what seems to be the norm after that first resurrection. Note here in 1 Corinthians 15 what we find. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51. The Apostle Paul writes, "Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep," or we shall not all die. That's what it means. That's the way the New Revised Standard translates it. We shall not all die, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling or the blink of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we, that is, we who are still alive, Paul said, shall be changed. Since the Bible contains no mention whatsoever of any other general or mass resurrection to eternal life, all of the remainder of humanity who will receive eternal life will do so by the process that God originally established at the creation of man. Once Christ returns, the restoration of all things will occur. Humanity's access to the tree of life will again be given. That access was denied after the first human sin, and then at that time it will be restored, allowing mankind to receive the gift of eternal life without experiencing death in the manner that it has been experienced since the time of Adam. Again, their bodies will cease to be. Those who enter into eternal life after the first resurrection, their bodies will cease to be when they are changed from flesh to spirit, just like the bodies of the saints who are alive at the last trump. Because Paul says they're going to be changed instantly from being mortal to being immortal. So the flesh reverts back to spirit and eternal life is given to them. Normal birth, as we all know, requires remaining in the womb until gestation is complete, from the time of conception until the time of birth. All right, once it's complete. After which, when that time comes, the child then passes directly from its place of conception and gestation. It passes into a new environment. And you know what? Unless it's stillborn or something happens, death is not part of the process of birth. Death is not part of the process of birth. Birth into a human family is a type of birth into the family of God. All who live during the millennial reign of Jesus Christ and those who are resurrected to physical life during the white throne judgment will live their entire lives knowing God. You know, we know that from Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, and 37. They'll know God, and they'll know God's way. The culmination of those physical lives will be death if they choose to remain unrepentant sinners. Or the end results will be everlasting life if they choose to yield to God. In Isaiah 65, let's go back and note this. Isaiah chapter 65. All right, and verse 17, God says, "For behold, I create new heavens, plural, and a new earth." Well, after we read the trumpet plagues, it's very obvious that the first heaven here, the atmosphere, is going to have to be created new because it's going to be full of radiation from nuclear blasts, dust, whatever, all the pollutants that are going to happen, you know, with everything burning. So, yeah, going to have to be new heavens and a new earth. "And the former shall not be remembered or come to mind." Or as the New Living Translation says, "And no one will even think about the old ones anymore." Oh, remember the good old days? You know, like the Israelites. Oh, just remember how it was when we were in Egypt, in slavery to the Pharaoh. You know, to say the good old days? Oh, the good old days when, you know, we were there in the old world and Satan was in charge. No, they're not going to. No one, it says, will even think about the old ones anymore because there's nothing good about the old days. Not when we look at our place in humanity. Humanity has not had what is coming. Verse 18, Tanakh goes on, "Be glad then and rejoice forever in what I am creating," God says, "for I shall create Jerusalem as a joy and her people as a delight. And I will rejoice in Jerusalem and delight in her people. Never again shall be heard there the sounds of weeping and wailing. No more weeping and wailing? No more crying? No. That would indicate that there are no dead loved ones to mourn over due to a premature death. Why not? Well, it goes on to say here in verse 20, New Revised Standard translates, no more shall there be in it, in that new heavens, new earth. No longer shall there be in that time humanity at large, an infant that lives but a few days, or an old person who does not live out a lifetime. For one who dies at 100 years will be considered a youth. Well, remember what we read in Zechariah 8, old men and women in the streets, on canes for very age. The one who dies at 100 will be considered a youth. The one who dies. Now, what does that mean? Well, death. Well, that is the one whose physical body ceases to live, just as it will be with the first fruits at the moment that they're changed from flesh to spirit. Their physical bodies will cease to live, but the life that they have goes on in a different form without the loss of consciousness. There's no death. It's just consciousness moves from the realm of mortality to the realm of immortality. Going on, and one who falls short of 100 will be considered accursed. Now again, only those with a rebellious, unrepentant lifestyle will suffer physical death in the same manner as it is now. Will there be any of those? I don't know. It's hard to say. God's going to have to heal an awful lot of minds when it comes down to especially the white throne judgment period. Going to have to heal a lot of minds because there are minds that are so perverted today, they cannot look at anything rationally. They're totally irrational. Latter part of verse 22, he says, for as the days of a tree, so shall be the days of my people. The lifespans of humans will be well past 70. There will be no more premature deaths because Satan will not be around to cause the destruction that ends life prematurely. No more tears of mourning will be shed, only the sound of joy and rejoicing will be heard. That's what we've read through Isaiah. We're gathered during this fall festival period, as we are commanded to, back in Leviticus 23, looking forward to the relief that the whole world will experience when the times of restoration of all things finally comes. But during this time, while living under the distressful, burdensome circumstances caused by the rule of Satan the devil, that old dragon, during this time, when we look forward to what will be, what can we do to avoid falling prey to the activities of the rider of the first two horses? Deception and division. God has given His people, back in Hebrews chapter 4, God has given His people a sword to use to resist the devil and defend themselves from those riders. Here in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12. Again, memory verse. For the word of God is living and powerful, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. And we've got to discern those, and with the presence of Christ and His righteousness, we should be able to see them. The edges of God's two-edged sword depict what is needed to resist and conquer the devil's tactics. And he is at work now doing his best to destroy God's people along with the rest of humanity. Those edges are defined in what Jesus decreed back here in Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22, verse 36. Matthew 22, 36, we find, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God. How? With all your heart. He gets it all. You can't hold anything back for yourself. He gets it all. all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, not less than. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, the law and the prophets that he mentions here refer to the entirety of the Holy Scriptures that were in existence at that time, but at that time when Jesus was here, in the flesh. Today, it would include the New Testament as well. Jesus tells us that the thrust of the entire Bible revolves around these two commandments: love God, love neighbor. Therefore, the two edges of the sword that we are given there in Hebrews 4:12, love God and love your neighbor. They're part. Those are the edges of the sword. The first edge, love God. And by loving God, that protects us from deception. If we're truly loving God, we will be protected from deception. When we keep the first four of the Ten Commandments, and you can throw the fifth one in there because we honor Him as well. Okay? When we keep those four in particular, with all our heart, with all our soul, with all of our mind, that means we're drawing near to God. And He draws near to us, we're told in James chapter 4. We've covered that several times through the feast. In the presence of His light. Because if He's close to us, we're close to Him. We're in His light. In that light, we can see the devil's activity clearly, which means we can't be deceived. But if we're not in His light, we can be. The second edge of the sword, love your neighbor, protects us from division. When we practice the final 6 commandments, we allow Satan no space whatsoever to drive a wedge between us and any other person. But we've got to love them as ourselves. Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't think that he's less than or she's less than you, but as you are. As we've all experienced, even with the two-edged sword in our possession, we find that of ourselves we simply don't have the strength necessary to defend ourselves from the first 2 horsemen. Again, we require help in the use of the sword. Only those who humble themselves and allow Christ to live in them will have that strength, the power to successfully defend themselves until the times of refreshing and restoration of all things comes. Only the humble will have the strength to endure all things until then. Brethren, as we come to the close of these 2 final annual festivals, the Feast of Tabernacles yesterday and the Feast of the 8th day, last great day today, which portray the times of the 2nd and 3rd days of judgment for salvation, the times when all of humanity will experience the result of the restitution and restoration of all things. Let's be thankful that God has provided us with this understanding. Because with this understanding, we can see the need to quit dwelling, as we read earlier in Isaiah 43, verse 18. We can see the need to quit dwelling on past events and brooding over times gone by. Thinking there were good old days. No, there weren't. And we can then look forward, greatly anticipating the restoration of all of God's blessings over all earth. Our anticipation for that time should cause us to be more fervent in our prayers for God's kingdom to come. Just as Moses was in his prayer, if you'll remember when we started back in Psalm 90 in verse 14, where clearly Moses was looking forward to that time because he prayed, Psalm 90:14, "Oh, satisfy us early." Technically, the word in the Hebrew, better translated in the Tanakh, means at daybreak. Satisfy us at daybreak. When is daybreak? It's when the Son of Righteousness comes and His light finally covers the earth. When there's no more darkness, the truth is no longer hidden. Satisfy us at daybreak with your mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days in which you have humbled us. It's better in the Revised English Bible. The 6 days in which you have humbled us, and the years, the 6,000 years in which we have seen evil. Make us glad according to the time that man has been cut off from the tree of life, awaiting the time of restoration of all things. Because all of humanity will rejoice. All of humanity will be glad during the times of judgment that follow the coming of the Son of Righteousness, when He brings about the restoration of all things.